A giant cowboy rescued an obese 18-year-old from quicksand, but what he did to her next shocked everyone. The spring river was raging, the mud sucking her under. One wrong move and she'd be gone forever. But when the giant pulled her free, the real danger was only beginning. By sundown, the whole town was whispering, twisting the story into scandal. Her father wanted her married off that night, and a cruel railroad foreman was already laying claim to her life. The cowboy could walk away, or risk his own neck to protect her. But as the dust rose and the church bell tolled, he uncovered a truth far worse than gossip, one that could cost them both everything. Will saving her from the quicksand be the easy part, compared to what comes next? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The raw spring wind whipped through the cottonwoods, their branches creaking and swaying against the pewter sky. Gideon McCall sat easy in his saddle, letting his sorrel pick its way along the muddy riverbank. The cattle delivery had gone smooth enough, though the rising waters had forced him to take the long way home. His mount's hooves squelched in the soggy earth, matching the rushing sound of the swollen river. A cry pierced the air, high and desperate, barely carrying over the water's roar. Gideon yanked his horse to a stop, scanning the riverbank. There, about 50 yards ahead, a figure thrashed in what looked like shallow water near the bank. "Help! Please, somebody help me!" The voice was female, thick with panic. Gideon's heart clenched as he recognized Hattie Lou Carter, the quiet girl who sometimes helped at the general store. She was waist-deep in muck, her blue calico skirts plastered to her legs with grey mud. Her face had gone pale as milk, eyes wide with terror as she tried to pull free. Quicksand. The spring floods had turned the riverbank treacherous. "Hold still, Miss Carter," Gideon called out, already swinging down from his saddle. "The more you fight, the deeper you'll sink." He grabbed his saddle rope with practiced hands, quickly tying one end to the thick trunk of a nearby cottonwood. The other end he looped around his own waist, testing the knots with sharp tugs. The bank wasn't stable. One wrong step and he'd be trapped alongside her. "I'm coming to you," he said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Just stay as still as you can." Hattie nodded, tears cutting clean tracks down her mud-spattered cheeks. Her hands trembled as she held them up, reaching towards him. Gideon eased onto the treacherous ground, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The mud pulled at his boots, trying to claim them. He could feel the sick way it shifted under his feet, but the rope gave him confidence to press forward. "Almost there," he murmured. "You're doing fine." When he finally reached her, Hattie's teeth were chattering. From cold or fear, he couldn't tell. Probably both. She grabbed for his outstretched hands, and he had to catch her wrists instead. "Easy now," he cautioned. "Let me do the work. On 3, I'm going to pull. You try to keep your legs straight, like you're standing up from a chair. Ready?" She managed a shaky nod. 1, 2, 3. Gideon threw his weight backward, muscles straining as he hauled against the hungry mud. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, with a wet sucking sound, Hattie began to rise from the mire. One leg came free, then the other. The force of it sent them both sprawling onto the damp grass beyond the quicksand's reach. They lay there, panting, Hattie's sobs muffled against his shoulder as she clutched at his sleeve. Her whole body shook with delayed terror and cold. "You're safe now," Gideon said softly, patting her hand. "Just catch your breath." After a few minutes, he helped her sit up. She was covered head to toe in grey mud, her neat bun coming loose in soggy strands. Without thinking, he shrugged out of his trail coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling it close. I was sure. Best not to dwell on it," he said gently. "Can you stand?" She nodded, though her legs wobbled when he helped her up. His sorrel stood waiting patiently, and Gideon led her over, keeping a steadying hand at her elbow. "I'll boost you up," he said. "You can ride while I lead us back to town." The walk was slow, giving them both time to settle. As the worst of her shaking eased, Hattie began to speak in halting sentences about what had brought her to the riverbank. "Father's been trying to fix my future," she said, twisting her hands in the reins. "He says with the ranch struggling, decisions have to be made." Something in her tone made Gideon's jaw tighten, but she wouldn't say more. They passed the rest of the journey in silence, broken only by the gentle clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a meadowlark. The sun was settling toward the horizon by the time they reached Carter's Crossing. Gideon knew the picture they made. Him leading his horse, Hattie perched in his saddle, both of them liberally splattered with mud. Heads turned as they passed the general store. Mrs. Peterson dropped her basket of eggs. Old Man Jenkins actually stopped mid-stride, his pipe falling from his open mouth. Hattie ducked her head, cheeks flaming red beneath the mud streaks. Gideon kept his eyes forward, his stride purposeful. Let them stare. He'd done what needed doing, same as he would for anyone in trouble. They reached the hitching post outside the Carter place just as dusk was starting to purple the sky. Gideon helped Hattie down, steadying her when her legs threatened to give out again. "Much obliged," she said softly, starting to shrug out of his coat. "Keep it for now," he said. "You're still shivering." The front door burst open before she could protest. Amos Carter stood in the doorway, his weather-beaten face darkening at the sight of them. "Hattie Lou! Where in tarnation have you been? And what's the meaning of—" He broke off, taking in their mud-covered state and Gideon's protective stance beside his daughter. "Your daughter had a mishap at the river, Mr. Carter," Gideon said evenly. "Quicksand. She's had a bad fright, but she's unharmed." Amos's face went through a series of expressions, shock, concern, and something else Gideon couldn't quite read, before settling into a scowl. "Well then," he said gruffly, "best get inside, girl, and get cleaned up before you catch your death." He fixed Gideon with a hard stare. "Much obliged for your help, McCall, but we can manage from here." Gideon tipped his hat, watching as Hattie climbed the porch steps. She paused at the door, looking back at him with those soft, brown eyes. "Thank you," she whispered again, then disappeared inside. The door closed with a final sounding thud, leaving Gideon alone with the gathering dark and the whispers that would surely be racing through town by morning. The Frontier Hotel's dining room glowed with warmth from the pot-bellied stove, a welcome sight after the chill of the muddy river. Gideon guided Hattie through the doorway, his large hand steady at her elbow. Her skirts still dripped, leaving dark patches on the plank floor. "Here now," he said softly, leading her toward the iron stove. "Let's get you warmed up." Mrs. Whitaker, the hotel proprietor's wife, rushed over with a concerned frown. "Land sakes, child. What happened to you?" "Quicksand, ma'am," Gideon answered, settling Hattie into a chair. "Down by Miller's Bend." The word rippled through the dining room like a stone dropped in still water. Heads turned. Whispers started. A woman in a green calico dress clapped her hands over her young son's ears, shooting them a scandalized look. "Alone?" "With him?" The whisper carried clearly across the room. Hattie's shoulders hunched, her face flaming red beneath the drying mud. Gideon felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. "Miss Carter needed help. I provided it." The dining room door banged open. Amos Carter stood in the doorway, his face as red as a summer tomato. Behind him, several townsfolk craned their necks to see, drawn by the commotion. "What's the meaning of this?" Carter demanded, stalking toward them. "First you bring my daughter home looking like she'd been dragged through a pig wallow. Now I find you've paraded her through town to sit with you in public." "Now, Amos," Mrs. Whitaker started, but Carter cut her off. "Don't you— Now, Amos me! This man has compromised my daughter's reputation. Hours alone with her, God knows where—" "By the river," Judge Matthews spoke up from his corner table. The elderly justice of the peace set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Where, by all accounts, he saved the girl's life. That don't excuse— No, the judge agreed mildly. But there is an honourable solution. He stood, straightening his vest. I could perform the ceremony right now, tonight, put all this unpleasantness to rest. The room went silent. Hattie's face drained of colour, her hands trembling in her lap. Gideon felt his own spine stiffen. No, he said firmly. Carter's head snapped around. What did you say? I said no. Gideon kept his voice steady, though anger simmered beneath. No woman should be forced into marriage vows under duress, not even to save her reputation. Fresh whispers erupted around the room. Mrs. Whittaker pressed her hands to her chest, looking faint. The woman in green hustled her son towards the door, muttering about loose morals. Well, I never! Someone gasped. Amos Carter's face had gone from red to purple. You'd rather leave her reputation in tatters? After what you've done? What I've done, Gideon said evenly, is keep your daughter from drowning in quicksand. Nothing more, nothing less. He turned to Hattie, who sat frozen in her chair. Miss Carter, I apologize if my actions have caused you distress. That was never my intention. Hattie nodded jerkily, but couldn't seem to find her voice. Her father grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. Come along, girl. We're going home. He steered her toward the door, then paused to glare back at Gideon. Clayton Sutter won't be pleased about this delay, I can tell you that much. The name landed like a physical blow. Gideon had heard of Sutter, the railroad foreman who'd been buying up water rights all along the river. None of what he'd heard had been good. The dining room slowly emptied after the Carters left, patrons drifting away to spread the evening's excitement through town. Gideon stayed, ordering a simple supper of beef stew and cornbread. He had no appetite, but he needed time to think. He was halfway through his meal when voices drifted in from the saloon next door. Through the thin wall he could hear Sutter's crew, their words thick with whiskey. Did you see Carter's girl? Built like a barn door, she is. Cruel laughter followed. Yeah, but beggars can't be choosers. Boss says once the papers are signed, we can— Gideon's spoon clattered against his bowl. The rest of their words were lost in raucous guffaws, but he'd heard enough. His appetite completely gone now, he stood and dropped coins on the table. Outside, the spring night had turned cool and clear. Stars pricked through the darkening sky as Gideon strode toward the livery stable. He had no right to interfere in Hattie Carter's life, but he couldn't forget the terror in her eyes at the river, or the way she'd trembled at the mention of her fixed future. Decision made, he saddled his horse. He would ride out to the Carter ranch, make sure Hattie made it home safe, and maybe learn what Clayton Sutter had to do with any of this. The moon cast long shadows across the muddy road as Gideon followed the Carter wagon's tracks. His sorrel's hooves made soft thuds against the packed earth, each step carrying them further from town and deeper into the growing darkness. The night air held a bitter chill, warning that winter hadn't fully released its grip on the land. At the Carter ranch, yellow lamplight spilled from downstairs windows. Gideon dismounted, ground-tying his horse near the gate. The porch steps creaked under his weight as he approached the door. Before he could knock, it flew open. Amos Carter filled the doorway, blocking any view inside. What do you want now? Evening, Mr. Carter. Just wanted to make sure Miss Hattie made it home all right after— She's fine. No thanks to you. Carter's fingers drummed against the doorframe. Behind him, a floorboard squeaked. Now get off my property. Sir, I heard some concerning talk in town about Clayton Sutter. Carter's face darkened. Ain't none of your business. He stepped forward, forcing Gideon back a step. My dealings with Sutter are private, and my daughter's future ain't your concern neither. Pa? Hattie's voice drifted from inside. Who's there? Nobody. Carter snapped over his shoulder. Then to Gideon. Leave. Now, before I fetch my shotgun. The door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Gideon stood for a moment, jaw clenched, before turning toward his horse. Movement caught his eye, a pale face in an upstairs window. Hattie pressed one hand against the glass, her expression desperate in the moonlight. He paused, glancing back at the dark house. After a moment, the window creaked open slightly. "Mr. McCall," her whisper barely carried on the night air. "Please wait." Gideon moved closer, keeping to the shadows. "What's wrong?" "It's Sutter." Her voice trembled. "He's coming tomorrow morning. Pa promised me to him, to settle some debts." She choked back a sob. "Please don't let him take me. I'd rather die than—" "Hattie!" Carter's voice boomed from inside. "You better not be at that window, girl!" "I have to go," she whispered frantically. "Please." Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs. "If you need to leave, quick," he said low and fast. "Be ready. I won't let him hurt you." The window closed just as heavy footsteps approached. Gideon melted into the darkness, swinging onto his horse and riding away before Carter could spot him. But sleep was long in coming that night, his mind full of Hattie's terrified face and the thought of Clayton Sutter's cruel smile. Morning brought steel-grey clouds and a raw wind. Gideon rode past the Carter place just as the sun cleared the eastern hills. His breath caught at the sight of Sutter's distinctive black wagon parked in the yard. Two of the railroad man's thugs lounged against the fence, passing a bottle between them. Gideon guided his horse into a stand of cottonwoods, thick enough to conceal them both. From this vantage, he could see the house clearly while remaining hidden. Time crawled by like molasses in winter. His fingers ached from gripping the reins too tight. Finally, after what felt like hours, the front door opened. Sutter emerged, adjusting his vest with a satisfied smirk that made Gideon's blood run cold. The railroad man climbed onto his wagon seat, gathering the reins with practiced ease. "Tomorrow then, Carter," he called over his shoulder. "I'll send the boys to collect her first thing." Amos appeared in the doorway, looking drawn and grey. "Just remember our deal. The water rights will be yours soon as the papers are signed." Sutter's laugh held no warmth. "Your girl's a fair trade for prime riverfront property, even if she is a bit substantial." He clicked to his team, wheels crunching through the yard. Gideon waited until the wagon disappeared around the bend before spurring his horse toward home. He had preparations to make before nightfall. The moon was a thin slice in the sky when he returned, leading a fresh mount. He positioned himself where the road curved past Miller's Bend, just out of sight of the Carter ranch. Minutes stretched like hours as he waited, straining to hear anything beyond the river's constant voice. At last, soft footsteps approached through the darkness. Hattie emerged from the shadows, clutching a small carpet bag. Her face was pale but determined in the weak moonlight. "You came," she breathed, relief clear in her voice. "I promised I wouldn't let him hurt you." Gideon dismounted, moving to help her up onto the spare horse. "Did anyone see you leave?" She shook her head, fingers white-knuckled on the saddle horn. "Pa takes a sleeping powder most nights now, ever since ... She swallowed hard. "Since he made the deal with Sutter." "You're sure about this?" Gideon asked quietly. "Once we ride out, there's no going back easy." Hattie's chin lifted. "I'm sure. I won't be sold like cattle to a man like Clayton Sutter. I'd rather take my chances with someone who showed me kindness than stay for certain cruelty." The simple truth in her words struck him hard. Gideon nodded, swinging back into his saddle. "Then we'd best ride. Dawn's coming soon enough, and we need distance before they realize you're gone." They turned their horses north, away from the sleeping town and the life Hattie was leaving behind. The night wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain as they rode side by side into uncertainty. The night air bit cold and damp as they rode double on Gideon's sorrel, leaving the spare horse behind to avoid telltale tracks. Mist rose from the meadow grass like ghostly fingers wrapping around the horse's fetlocks. Hattie clung to Gideon's coat, her arms stiff and awkward around his waist. "Sorry," she whispered when she bumped against him during a rough patch. "Not much practice riding." "No need to apologize." Gideon kept his voice low, though they were far from any listeners. "Horse knows the way. You just hold on." The sorrel picked its path carefully through the darkness, heading steadily north toward the foothills. After an hour, Hattie's breathing grew laboured, her grip loosening with fatigue. Gideon reined in beside a lightning-struck oak. "Let's rest a spell." He helped her down, steadying her when her legs wobbled. "Catch your breath." Hattie sank onto a fallen log, rubbing her thighs. "I'm slowing us down something awful." "We've got time." Gideon offered his canteen. "Still a few hours till dawn." They rested twice more before reaching the line shack, a sturdy one-room cabin tucked against a steep ridge. Moonlight gleamed off the tin roof, and wind whistled through gaps in the chinked logs. Gideon dismounted first, then lifted Hattie down, her legs nearly buckled. "Almost there," he assured her, supporting her weight as they crossed to the door. Inside, he found the tin of matches exactly where he'd left them on the shelf. The fireplace still held old ashes and kindling. "Sit," he told Hattie, gesturing to the room's single chair. "I'll get a fire going." Soon flames crackled, pushing back the darkness and chill. Gideon set coffee to boil while Hattie spread her damp skirts near the hearth. The familiar tasks helped settle his mind, though his ears stayed sharp for any sound beyond the cabin's walls. "Reckon it's time you told me the whole of it," he said quietly, passing her a tin cup of coffee. "About Sutter and your pa." Hattie's hands trembled slightly as she took the cup. "It started with the February blizzard. We lost near 30 head of cattle when they drifted against the fence line. Pa, he'd borrowed heavy that fall, counting on spring sales to make it right." She stared into the fire. "Then Sutter came calling, said he'd take care of everything, the debts, the mortgage, all of it, in exchange for water rights to the creek that runs through our south pasture. And you," Gideon added softly. She nodded, tears gleaming. "Pa tried to say no at first. But Sutter, he knows things about Pa, about some cattle that maybe weren't exactly ours back when times were harder. Said he'd see Pa in prison if he didn't agree." Her voice cracked. "I heard them arguing. Sutter said I'd do fine for his needs. Said he likes his women with some meat on their bones." Gideon's hand tightened on his coffee cup until his knuckles went white. "You're safe now. He won't touch you." "But for how long?" Hattie whispered. "He won't just let this go. He never does." Before Gideon could answer, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. He doused the lamp with one quick movement, then grabbed Hattie's arm. "Out the back. Quick and quiet." They slipped through the rear door into the timber, keeping low. Hattie pressed close to his side, breathing fast but staying silent as the riders approached. Voices carried through the pre-dawn darkness. "Check the shack," someone called. "Thompson, circle round back." Gideon recognized the voice, Wade Rawlins, one of Sutter's hired guns. He pulled Hattie deeper into the shadows of a dense spruce grove. They crouched there, barely breathing, as boots crunched through fallen needles nearby. "Nothing here," Thompson shouted after a few minutes. "But the ashes are warm. They ain't far." "Keep searching," Rawlins ordered. "Sutter wants the girl found by sunrise." The riders moved off, hoofbeats fading into the grey dawn. Gideon and Hattie waited until the forest fell silent before creeping back to the cabin. As they approached, something white caught Gideon's eye, a paper nailed to the door, fluttering in the morning breeze. He yanked it free, holding it close to read in the weak light. His jaw tightened as he scanned the words. "What is it?" Hattie asked. "Notice from the sheriff." Gideon's voice was grim. "Says I'm wanted for theft of Carter property and abduction." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "Sutter's work, no doubt. He's trying to force us back using the law." Hattie's face went pale. "But that's not true. I came willing." "Truth won't matter much to a judge who's in Sutter's pocket." Gideon stared into the lightening east. "And your pa's signature's likely on that complaint. What do we do now?" "We keep moving." Gideon touched her shoulder gently. "I won't let them take you back to him. I give you my word on that." The sun crested the ridge, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. In that growing light, Hattie's eyes met his, filled with both fear and trust. Whatever came next, they were in it together now. Dawn's pale light guided them north along the old stage road, keeping to the tree line where possible. Gideon led them on a winding path through the foothills, crossing streams to muddle their trail. By mid-morning, weathered adobe walls came into view, standing lonely against the spring sky. Mission San Miguel, Gideon explained, helping Hattie down from the horse. Been abandoned near 10 years now, since the fever took most of the settlement. The mission house stood solid despite its age, its thick walls protecting it from wind and weather. A bell tower rose from one corner, missing several tiles but still proud. Dry garden beds stretched behind the building, bordered by tumbled stones. "Wait here," Gideon said, drawing his revolver. He approached the heavy wooden door, checking the ground. "Got to make sure no rattlers moved in while I was gone." Hattie wrapped her arms around herself, watching as he circled the building. "You've been here before?" "Used it as shelter during winter roundups." Gideon returned, holstering his weapon. "Found some shed snake skins, but they're old. Still, I'll show you how to check before going inside. Could save your life out here." He demonstrated how to probe doorways and dark corners with a long stick, explaining the signs of snake activity. Hattie paid close attention, her face serious as she practiced the movements. "Look for fresh tracks in dust," he instructed, "and always listen for that warning rattle. Better to be extra careful than surprised." Inside, dust motes danced in sunbeams streaming through gaps in the roof. The main room held a stone fireplace, some broken furniture, and blessed coolness after their morning ride. A smaller chamber off to one side still had shelves built into the walls. Gideon unpacked his saddlebags, laying out their meager supplies on a rickety table. "Got jerked beef, flour, coffee, and some hard biscuits. Not much, but it'll keep us going." "I can make it stretch," Hattie said, already examining the fireplace. "If we can get this drawing proper, I could bake bread. Even got my sourdough starter in my satchel." He looked at her with newfound respect. Smart thinking, bringing that. They worked together through the afternoon, making the place more livable. Hattie found an old broom in a corner and attacked the dust while Gideon patched the worst roof leaks with canvas from his saddlebags. The rainwater cistern behind the mission proved half full, enough for their needs if they were careful. As evening approached, Gideon built a small fire in the fireplace, keeping the smoke minimal to avoid drawing attention. They shared a simple meal of beef and biscuits, letting the warmth chase away the growing chill. "Why are you doing all this?" Hattie finally asked, her voice soft in the firelit quiet. "Helping me, I mean. You're risking everything." Gideon stared into the flames for a long moment. "Had a younger brother once. Samuel. He wasn't strong like me, sickly from birth. Town bullies used to torment him something awful." His hands tightened on his coffee cup. "One day they chased him onto thin ice. I wasn't there to stop them." He took a slow breath. "Since then, I can't abide seeing the strong prey on the weak. Just ain't right." Hattie reached across the space between them, touching his arm gently. "I'm sorry about your brother." He nodded, not trusting his voice for a moment. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow's likely to be busy." Morning brought steel-grey clouds rolling in from the north, promising late spring snow. Hattie was already up when Gideon returned from checking the horses, her sleeves rolled up as she worked at the windows. "Found some old blankets," she explained, tucking fabric into gaps around the frames. "Should help keep the draft out when that weather hits." "Good thinking." Gideon studied the clouds. "I need to ride out, try to find more supplies before the storm comes. Game's usually active before snow, might get lucky with some rabbit or grouse." "I'll keep working here," Hattie said. "That garden might still have some winter roots we could use, and I saw herbs growing wild near the cistern." She'd already transformed the main room, clearing years of debris and arranging their few possessions with care. The place felt more like a home than a hideout, despite its bare walls and broken furniture. "Be careful," Gideon warned. "Keep watching for snakes, and if anyone comes, hide in the bell tower." She finished. "I remember. You be careful too." He nodded, checking his ammunition before heading out. The air had grown heavier, promising weather soon. They'd need more food to wait out whatever was coming, and he needed to make sure no one had followed their trail this far north. Hattie watched him ride away, then turned back to her tasks. There was much to do before the storm arrived, and she meant to prove herself useful. She might not be able to fight like Gideon, but she knew how to make a place habitable and stretch supplies to their limit. In the garden, she found turnips gone wild and tough winter onions hanging on in corners. The herbs near the cistern included sage and wild mint. Not much, but better than nothing. She gathered what she could, humming softly as she worked. The old mission slowly came back to life under their care, offering sanctuary from more than just the coming storm. For now, at least, they had found refuge. And perhaps something more valuable. A partnership built on trust and shared purpose. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Gideon saddled his sorrel. The morning air held a sharp bite, warning of the coming storm. He'd watched Hattie sleeping peacefully near the hearth before he left, curled beneath his spare blanket. The trail to the Ute settlement wound through stands of cedar and pine, climbing steadily into the foothills. Gideon kept alert, scanning for signs of pursuit. By mid-morning, smoke from cooking fires drew his eye to the cluster of lodges nestled against the hillside. Henry stood outside his lodge, as if expecting him. The scout's weathered face creased in a slight smile. "Brother," he greeted, raising one hand. "The spirits told me you might come." "Much obliged for the welcome." Gideon dismounted, leading his horse. "Need your counsel, friend, and whatever food you might spare." Inside the lodge, Henry's wife stirred a pot of beans while they talked. The scout listened carefully to Gideon's account of recent events, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Sutter has hired trackers," Henry said finally, accepting a cup of coffee. "2 men from the Cherokee Nation, working for railroad money. They passed through yesterday, asking questions." He gestured to his wife, who began gathering supplies into a cloth sack. "Take this. Cornmeal, beans, dried meat. The girl will need strength." "I'm grateful," Gideon said. "Any word on why Sutter wants Carter's land so badly?" Henry nodded slowly. "The railroad needs water for steam engines. Carter's Spring is perfect spot for tank station. Good flow, never runs dry." He paused. "Sutter is their hammer, breaking what won't bend." "That explains some things." Gideon sighed, accepting the heavy sack of provisions. "Much obliged to you and your wife." "Watch the night," Henry warned as Gideon mounted up. "Coyotes that walk on 2 legs are hunting." Back at the mission, savory smells greeted Gideon as he approached. Inside, Hattie stood at the hearth, carefully turning golden corn cakes on a flat stone she'd cleaned for baking. A hymn tune carried softly on her breath. Amazing Grace. He recognized the melody his own mother had often sung. She turned at his entrance, face bright with accomplishment. "Welcome back. I found some wild onions and made these with the last of our flour." She gestured proudly to a rough-hewn table she'd assembled from broken furniture, set with 2 tin plates and cups. "It's not much, but it's better than trail food." "Looks fine," Gideon said, setting down his sack of provisions. "Henry sent supplies, cornmeal, beans, jerky, should keep us fed a while." They shared the simple meal, Hattie beaming at his praise of the corn cakes. As they finished, hoofbeats approached outside. Gideon's hand went to his gun, but he relaxed at a familiar whistle. Henry appeared in the doorway, a young man of about 16 summers beside him. "My sister's son, Thomas," he introduced. "We brought gift." Thomas held up a plump rabbit. Come in," Hattie exclaimed, already reaching for her cooking pot. "There's still some corn cakes, and I can start a stew." While Hattie worked, Henry shared what he'd learned. "Railroad wants to build water tank at your father's spring." he told her gently. 10,000 gallons for steam engines. Sutter's job is getting the land, any way he can. Hattie's hand stilled on the pot handle. So that's why... She swallowed hard. That's why Pa was so set on that arrangement. Sutter promised him something. Money, probably, Gideon said. Enough to save the ranch after losing those cattle. I won't go back, Hattie said firmly, though her voice shook slightly. I won't be sold to that man, not for all the railroad money in Denver. Thomas helped her prepare the rabbit while Henry and Gideon discussed defense of the mission. The abandoned building was easily secured, with thick walls and clear lines of sight. But they couldn't stay forever. Sooner or later, Sutter's men would widen their search this far north. As evening settled in, they shared rabbit stew and quiet conversation. Henry taught Hattie several Ute words, pleased at her quick grasp of the language. Thomas proved to have a fine singing voice, joining her in a hymn she knew. The peaceful moment shattered as a coyote's howl echoed from the darkness. Henry and Gideon exchanged sharp looks. The call pattern was too regular, too measured. Signal, Henry said softly. 2 legs, not 4. How close? Gideon moved to check his rifle. Far ridge, east side, watching. Henry stood smoothly. Thomas and I will go. Draw them off. Make them think you went west. He touched Gideon's shoulder. Be ready to move when time comes, brother. After their guests departed, Gideon doused the fire to bare coals. Hattie huddled near the hearth, her earlier confidence dimmed by fear. Try to rest, Gideon told her. I'll keep watch. He stationed himself by a window, rifle across his knees, listening to the night sounds. The false coyote call came twice more, moving slowly westward as Henry led their pursuers away from the mission. But Gideon kept his vigil, knowing this was only the beginning of their trials. In the faint glow of the banked fire, he could see Hattie had fallen into an uneasy sleep, her face troubled even in dreams. He'd sworn to protect her, and by God's grace, he meant to keep that promise. Whatever it might cost him. The mountain trail twisted like a serpent through dense pine forest. Gideon led his sorrel carefully over the rocky ground, one hand on the reins, the other ready to steady Hattie if she stumbled. The path Henry had marked for them climbed steadily higher into the foothills, away from the more traveled routes below. Careful here, Gideon warned, helping Hattie around a fallen log. Ground's treacherous after the rain. She nodded, face flushed from the climb. Though her skirts were mud-splattered and her boots worn, she hadn't uttered a single complaint. They'd been walking since dawn, leading the horse to preserve his strength on the steep terrain. Henry said the shepherd's hut should be just beyond that ridge, Gideon said, pointing to a rocky outcrop ahead. We can rest there a while. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees as they finally crested the rise. Below them sat a crude log structure, its roof partially collapsed on one side. Hattie's shoulders slumped slightly at the sight, but she straightened them again quickly. Well, she said with determined cheer, at least it has walls. Gideon couldn't help but smile. That it does. Let's see what we can do before dark. They led the horse down to a small clearing beside the hut. While Hattie gathered kindling for a fire, Gideon assessed the damaged roof. Several support beams had rotted through, leaving a gaping hole above what had once been a sleeping area. Hand me those pine boughs, he called to Hattie, who was already stacking smaller branches nearby. Together they wove a temporary patch, layering the fresh-cut boughs to create a waterproof barrier. By the time darkness fell, they had a snug enough shelter. Hattie had a small fire crackling in the stone hearth, and the familiar smell of coffee soon filled the single room. They shared a simple meal of jerky and the last of her corncakes. Not quite what you're used to, Gideon said apologetically. Hattie shrugged, warming her hands around her tin cup. Better than being Mr. Sutter's property. Her voice held a quiet steel that impressed him. The next 2 days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings, they foraged in the surrounding woods. Hattie proved particularly good at spotting edible plants, knowledge learned from her mother. She showed Gideon which mushrooms were safe, which berries to avoid. During the warm afternoons, they worked on making the hut more livable. Hattie mended their trail-worn clothes while Gideon repaired the door hinges and patched more holes in the roof. Her needle flew swift and sure through the fabric as she hummed hymns under her breath. "Ma taught me to make do," she explained when he commented on her skill. "Said a woman needs to know how to keep things whole and useful." On the second evening, as they sat by the fire, Hattie told stories about growing up on her father's ranch. Her face lit up describing the cattle drives, the spring roundups, the satisfaction of a well-made batch of preserves. When she laughed at the memory of falling into a rain barrel as a child, the sound startled them both with its brightness. Gideon found himself watching her more and more, the way she moved with quiet purpose, her gentle handling of his cranky horse, her stubborn determination to carry her share of the work despite her city-bred upbringing. She was nothing like the helpless burden he'd half expected. The peaceful interlude shattered on the third morning. Gunshots echoed across the valley, far off but clear in the mountain air. Gideon grabbed his rifle while Hattie quickly doused the fire. They waited in tense silence until hoofbeats approached from the north. Gideon relaxed only when Henry's distinctive whistle sounded outside. The scout's face was grave as he dismounted. "Sutter's men are combing the hills," he reported. "Moving this way. 2 groups, the Cherokee trackers, and some new hired guns from Denver." "How close?" Gideon asked, already mentally plotting escape routes. "Too close. They found signs near the creek crossing." Henry paused. "Mission House might be safer now. Stone walls, better shelter from weather. They won't expect you to double back." Hattie was already rolling their blankets. "How long do we have? If we leave now, we can make it before dark. Rain's coming. We'll hide our trail." They packed quickly, leaving the hut as they'd found it. The first fat drops were falling as they started down the mountain, taking a different route than their ascent. The rain grew steady, soaking through their clothes but offering welcome cover. Hattie stumbled once on the slick rocks. Gideon caught her arm, steadying her. "You all right?" She nodded, pushing wet hair from her face. "Just clumsy. I won't slow us down." "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "Better than many would." The ghost of a smile crossed her face before she focused again on the treacherous path. Henry led them on a winding route through dense timber, doubling back occasionally to confuse any pursuit. By late afternoon, the familiar bell tower of the mission house came into view through the rain-swept trees. They approached cautiously, but the building stood empty and undisturbed. Inside, water dripped through a few holes in the roof, but the thick adobe walls had kept the interior relatively dry. "Home sweet home," Hattie said with a tired laugh, wringing out her skirts. While Henry checked the perimeter, Gideon helped her restart a fire in the hearth. She moved around the room with familiar efficiency, setting things to rights as if they'd never left. Watching her, Gideon felt a surge of admiration. This wasn't the same frightened girl he'd pulled from Quicksand. Hardship had revealed a core of strength in her that matched the gentle kindness he'd first noticed. The rain drummed steadily on the mission roof as night fell. They shared a meal of dried beef and foraged greens, speaking little but comfortable in their silence. Henry took first watch, leaving Gideon and Hattie by the fire. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear. "For what?" "For seeing me as someone worth protecting, worth treating with respect." She met his eyes steadily. "Not many do." Gideon started to respond, but Henry's low whistle from the door drew his attention. Time to set the night watch. The danger wasn't past, but they'd face it together, behind these strong stone walls. The mission house settled into an uneasy rhythm as spring deepened into early summer. Each dawn brought both hope and watchfulness. Gideon took to scanning the horizon before stepping outside, rifle always within reach. But life had to go on, and Hattie refused to let fear rule their days. One bright morning, she knelt in the patch of turned earth beside the mission, carefully placing corn kernels in the rich soil. Henry's sister Sarah had brought her a deerskin pouch full of seeds. corn, beans, and squash, along with stories of how the three plants helped each other grow strong. The corn gives the beans something to climb, Sarah had explained, demonstrating with gentle hands. The beans feed the soil, and the squash leaves shade the ground to hold water. Now Hattie worked steadily, her skirts spread around her in the dirt, humming as she planted. The garden wasn't large, just a modest plot where previous inhabitants had once grown herbs, but it gave her purpose. Every morning and evening she tended it faithfully. Inside the mission, Gideon's hammer rang against wood as he reinforced another window frame. He'd already strengthened the heavy door with iron bands from an abandoned wagon and built sturdy shutters for every window. The old mission was becoming a fortress, though they tried not to dwell on why it needed to be. "Gideon," Hattie called from the doorway one Sunday morning, twisting her apron in her hands. "I've been thinking." He looked up from cleaning his rifle. "What's on your mind?" "Well, it's Sunday, and I was remembering how back home we'd gather for singing after services." Her words came faster now. "And I thought, maybe we could invite folks here. For a hymn sing. To thank everyone who's helped us?" Gideon considered it carefully. Having so many people at the mission could be risky, but he saw the longing in her eyes. They'd been isolated for weeks now, with only Henry's family and a few trusted neighbors for company. "Reckon that might be nice," he said finally. "Henry's people too?" Hattie's face brightened. "Of course. Sarah taught me one of their songs about rain bringing life. It's beautiful." Word spread quickly. As the sun began its westward slide, people started arriving. Ranchers from hidden valleys, Ute families in bright blankets, even a few travelers who'd heard the singing from the road. They filled the mission's main room with warmth and voices. Hattie had swept the floors and set out tin cups of cool well water. Now she stood near the front, face glowing as she led familiar hymns. Her clear voice carried the melodies, while others added harmony or simply listened. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." The voices rose together, English and Ute words mingling. Sarah's children sat cross-legged near the front, watching with bright eyes as their mother sang in both languages. Between songs, people shared food and stories. A traveling peddler told tales from back east while Henry translated for the elders. Children played tag in the dusty yard outside. For a few precious hours, the tension that had gripped them all seemed to ease. During a quiet moment, Henry drew Gideon aside. They stepped out into the evening air, where the first stars were appearing above the mission's bell tower. "You care for her," Henry said simply. It wasn't a question. Gideon watched through the window as Hattie showed an older Ute woman how to shape the bread dough she'd prepared. "She's under my protection. More than that, my friend." Henry's dark eyes were knowing. "You should marry her, make it right in everyone's eyes." "That's not my choice to make." Gideon's voice was firm. "She's had enough of men making decisions about her life. If there's to be any marrying, it'll be her choice, in her own time." Henry nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Gideon McCall. But don't wait too long. Sometimes protection means giving someone the courage to choose." Inside, Hattie started another hymn, one about peace like a river. The gathered voices joined in, filling the mission with hope. Even some of the travelers who'd stopped by chance were singing now, caught up in the spirit of the evening. As the moon rose, people began saying their goodbyes. Hattie handed out the last of the bread she'd baked, receiving hugs and blessings in return. The children were sleepy, carried out wrapped in blankets. Soon only the closest neighbors remained, helping to set things in order. "That was real fine," old Jim Tucker said, adjusting his hat. "Reminds me of church socials back in Missouri. Does the heart good to sing together?" Hattie beamed at the praise, though Gideon noticed she looked tired now that the excitement was fading. She'd been on her feet for hours, making sure everyone felt welcome. The last guests mounted up under the star-lit sky. Henry lingered, making a slow circuit of the mission grounds. Gideon saw him pause near the corner where the garden wall met the main building. "Gideon," he called softly, Come look at this." In the soft dirt, barely visible in the moonlight, were fresh hoof prints. They led to the mission's back wall and away again, prints that hadn't been made by any of their friends. "Someone was watching," Henry said grimly, "staying just out of sight." Gideon studied the tracks, noting their depth and direction. "How long ago?" "During the singing, when everyone was inside." Henry's face was troubled. "They're getting bolder." The first hints of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when Gideon jerked awake. Something was wrong. The mission house stood silent, but an unnatural stillness pressed against the windows. The birds had stopped singing. He reached for his rifle, moving carefully to avoid waking Hattie, who slept on her pallet behind the curtain he'd hung for privacy. His boots made no sound on the packed earth floor as he approached the window. Through a gap in the shutters, dark shapes moved in the pre-dawn gloom. His heart sank. At least 8 men surrounded the mission. A branch snapped outside. Hattie stirred. "Gideon?" "Stay down," he whispered sharply. "We've got company." Before he could say more, the heavy door exploded inward, torn from its hinges by several men throwing their weight against it. Splinters flew as Clayton Sutter's men poured through the opening, guns drawn. Gideon fired once, catching the first man in the shoulder. The intruder fell back with a cry. But there were too many. They rushed him from multiple directions. "Get back!" Gideon shouted, swinging his rifle like a club when they got too close. He knocked one man senseless, but another caught him with a blow to the ribs. Hattie screamed as Sutter himself grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the door. "No, let me go! Gideon, take your hands off her!" Gideon lunged toward them, but 3 men tackled him from behind. His head cracked against the floor. Henry burst through the back door, knife drawn, but one of Sutter's men clubbed him across the temple. The Ute scout crumpled to the ground, blood trickling from his hairline. The sound of galloping horses cut through the chaos. "Law's coming!" someone shouted. Deputies thundered into the yard, rifles raised. "Everyone freeze!" But instead of restoring order, they headed straight for Gideon. 2 deputies roughly hauled him to his feet, while another snapped iron shackles around his wrists. "Gideon McCall," the lead deputy announced. "You're under arrest for abduction and assault." "That's a lie!" Hattie struggled against Sutter's grip. "He saved me!" "Clayton Sutter is the one who—" "Quiet, girl," Sutter cut her off. "You're confused. We're taking you home to your father." Gideon fought against the restraints. "She's telling the truth. Check the legal records. Sutter's trying to force her into—" A deputy's fist drove into his stomach, doubling him over. "Save it for the judge." They dragged him outside where a prison wagon waited. Through blurry vision, he saw Hattie being forced into Sutter's buggy, tears streaming down her face as she reached toward him. Henry lay motionless in the dirt, though Gideon saw his fingers twitch. Still alive, thank God. The wagon rattled into town as the sun finally cleared the mountains. Gideon's head throbbed where it had hit the floor. The deputies marched him straight to the sheriff's office, shoving him into a hard wooden chair. Sheriff Mills leaned against his desk, studying Gideon with cold eyes. "You've caused quite a stir, McCall, abducting a young woman, assaulting men who tried to help her, resisting arrest. That's hanging offense territory. It's not what happened." Gideon kept his voice steady despite the rage and fear churning inside him. "Sutter tried to force himself on Hattie. Her father was going to trade her to settle a debt. I helped her escape. That's all. That's not what the witnesses say." The sheriff picked up a paper from his desk. Signed statements from Clayton Sutter, Amos Carter, and 3 respected townsmen. They all tell a different story. "They're lying. Henry can vouch." "The Indian?" Mills scoffed. "His word won't count for much against these gentlemen." Meanwhile, across town at the Carter Ranch, Sutter's men half-carried, half-dragged Hattie through the front door. Her father stood in the parlor, face dark with anger and shame. "Get her upstairs," he ordered. "Lock her in the back bedroom." "Father, please!" Hattie begged as they hauled her up the stairs. "Don't let them do this. Gideon was only trying to protect me." But Amos Carter turned away. unable to meet his daughter's eyes. The door slammed shut, and Hattie heard the key turn in the lock. She collapsed onto the narrow bed, body shaking with sobs. Hours passed. The sun set in a blaze of red that seemed to mock the violence of the morning. Hattie had worn herself out crying, and now sat motionless by the window, staring at nothing. Her father's heavy footsteps approached. The key rattled, and he stepped into the room, carrying a tray of food she knew she wouldn't touch. "You need to eat something," he said gruffly. "How could you?" Her voice was raw. "How could you let them take him?" Amos set the tray down with a clatter. "That man kidnapped you, led you into sin and shame. You're lucky Sutter's still willing to have you after all this. Gideon saved me, from Sutter, from you, from being sold like cattle to pay your debts." She spun to face him, fists clenched. "He's a good man, the only one who cared what I wanted." "Stop it!" Amos grabbed her shoulders. "Listen to me, girl. Sutter owns half the judge and most of the jury. If you keep fighting this, keep claiming McCall's innocent, they'll hang him sure as sunrise." Hattie's face went pale. "What? Only way he might survive is if you cooperate. Marry Sutter quiet-like, tell everyone McCall forced you to go with him. Otherwise—" He let the threat hang in the air. Horror crept through Hattie's veins like ice water. She sank onto the bed, mind spinning. To save Gideon's life, she'd have to help destroy his reputation. Let everyone believe he was a criminal. Marry the very man they'd fled from. "I'll leave you to think on it," Amos said, moving towards the door. "But remember, his life's in your hands now." The lock clicked shut again. In the growing darkness, Hattie pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle a scream of despair. Somewhere in the sheriff's jail, Gideon sat in chains, perhaps thinking of her. The thought that he might die, because he'd tried to protect her, was unbearable. Outside her window, an owl called mournfully into the night. The sound felt like an echo of her own heart breaking. Moonlight filtered through the iron bars of Gideon's cell, casting stark shadows across the rough wooden floor. He sat on the narrow cot, head bowed, hands clasped tight. The night's chill seeped through his shirt, but he barely noticed it. "Lord," he whispered, "show me the way through this." Was I wrong to help her? To take her from that house? His conscience gave him no peace as he replayed every decision, every fork in the trail that had led him here. The Quicksand rescue, he'd do that again in a heartbeat. The refusal to marry her under pressure, that too felt right. But maybe he should have found another way to protect her. Someone with more influence. A woman's shelter in Denver, perhaps. Number the memory of Sutter's men planning crude things about Hattie in the cafe that night still made his blood boil. There hadn't been time for anything else. The cell door's hinges creaked. Sheriff Mills appeared with a tin cup of water. "Your Indian friend's here to see you," Mills said, voice gruff, but not entirely unkind. Henry limped into view, his head bandaged where Sutter's man had struck him. Despite his injury, his eyes were sharp and alert. "Brother," Henry said quietly, gripping the cell bars. He glanced at Mills, who stepped away to give them privacy. "You shouldn't be up yet," Gideon said. "Had to come." Henry's hand moved, quick and subtle, pressing something through the bars. A scrap of paper. "Circuit judge rides in 3 days from now." Gideon palmed the note, keeping his face neutral. 3 days is a long time in a cell. Or just long enough. Henry's meaningful look said more than words. "My sister asks after the girl. Haven't heard anything since they took her." Gideon's voice roughened. "Her father's probably got her under lock and key. Locks can be broken." Henry straightened, wincing slightly. "Keep faith, brother. Truth has a way of coming to light." After Henry left, Gideon unfolded the paper in the shadows where the night guard couldn't see. Written in Henry's careful hand were 3 words: "Gather your proof." Proof. His mind raced. The forged deeds Sutter used to steal water rights, the threats against homesteaders, the bribes to officials. If they could document it all before the circuit judge arrived. Miles away at the Carter Ranch, Hattie sat cross-legged on her bed, a plate of untouched supper growing cold on the side table. Her father had brought it himself, trying to coax her to eat, but she'd turned her face to the wall until he left. Now, in the quiet dark, she worked steadily at the window latch with a hairpin she'd saved from her escape supplies. The metal was thin but strong, and she'd watched the ranch hands pick enough locks to understand the basic idea. Her fingers trembled. If she failed, if anyone caught her. But Gideon's life was worth the risk. She thought of him in that cell, facing a hanging judge, all because he'd tried to help her. The memory gave her strength. Click! The latch sprang free. Hattie froze, listening for footsteps, but the house remained silent except for her father's distant snoring. Moving with exaggerated care, she changed into her sturdiest dress and boots. She couldn't take much: a shawl for warmth, the last of her mother's biscuits wrapped in a handkerchief, and the small amount of money she'd saved from selling eggs. The window opened with only the faintest squeal. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass. Hattie studied the climb down. The rose trellis looked sturdy enough, though she'd never tested it with her full weight before. "Lord, give me courage," she breathed, easing one leg over the sill. The wooden lattice creaked but held. Moving slowly, testing each foothold, she made her way down. Her heart pounded when her feet finally touched earth. She crouched in the shadows, scanning the yard. No movement except the wind in the cottonwoods. The mule pen lay behind the barn. Of all the animals, mules were smartest at keeping their footing in the dark. She'd need that tonight. Old Jenny, her favorite mule, lifted her head as Hattie approached. The animal's ears pricked forward in recognition. "Quiet now," Hattie whispered, slipping the halter on. She didn't dare use a saddle. The tack room would make too much noise. Instead, she fashioned a rope bridle and led Jenny to the fence. Mounting without a saddle proved challenging. After 2 failed attempts that left her winded, she used a fence post as a step and managed to scramble onto Jenny's broad back. "Good girl," she murmured, patting the mule's neck. "We're going to help Gideon." They set out at a steady pace, Jenny's hooves muffled in the spring grass. Hattie kept to the shadows along the tree line, away from the main road where Sutter's men might be watching. The moon sailed high overhead as they traveled. Hattie's legs ached from gripping the mule's sides, but she didn't slow. She knew these hills, had explored them since childhood. The Ute camp lay in a protected valley about 4 hours' ride away. Wind whipped her skirts as Jenny picked her way down a steep slope. Hattie leaned forward, praying her weight wouldn't unbalance the sure-footed animal. An owl swooped past, silent on velvet wings. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, a real one this time, not a signal like before. The familiar night sounds of the high country strengthened her resolve. She thought of Gideon in his cell, probably praying just as she was. They'd both chosen this path, chosen to stand against bullies and greed. Now they had to trust in God's justice working through the law. The moon was setting by the time she spotted the first glow of Ute campfires in the valley below. Jenny's sides heaved with exertion as they made their final descent. Henry's sister would be there. So would others who'd witnessed Sutter's schemes over the years. Together, they could gather the proof needed to save Gideon and stop Sutter from destroying more lives. Hattie straightened her spine, despite her exhaustion. The real fight was just beginning. Through the barred window of his cell, Gideon caught a glimpse of the same setting moon. His prayers had shifted from questions to determination. In 3 days, they would face the circuit judge. In 3 days, truth would have its chance against Sutter's lies. He touched the scrap of paper in his pocket, Henry's message burning like a coal of hope in the darkness. Gather your proof. Yes, it was time to fight back, not with fists, but with evidence and law. The Ute camp spread before Hattie in the pre-dawn light, a collection of sturdy lodges nestled against the valley walls. Cooking fires sent thin ribbons of smoke into the pearl-grey sky. Jenny's hooves crunched on gravel as they approached, drawing attention from the early risers. Henry's sister Sarah emerged from her lodge, her dark eyes widening at the sight of Hattie astride the bareback mule. Without hesitation, Sarah hurried forward to help her dismount. "You're half frozen," Sarah said, steadying Hattie as her stiff legs nearly buckled. "Come, sit by my fire." Inside the lodge, warmth from the hearth seeped into Hattie's chilled bones. Sarah pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands while other women gathered, their faces concerned. "They've arrested Gideon," Hattie explained, her voice trembling. "Sutter's men broke into the mission house and took him. The circuit judge arrives by mid-morning tomorrow, and without proof of what Sutter's done—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's expression hardened. "2 weeks ago I saw Sutter's men up by your father's spring. They were measuring and marking, talking about where to put the water tank. One had papers they kept checking." "Railroad papers." Hattie leaned forward eagerly. "They kept them in a leather case, took it to their shed by the rail camp when they finished." Sarah's eyes met Hattie's. "The same shed where they store their stolen brands?" A murmur went through the gathered women. Everyone knew about the mysterious disappearance of cattle from smaller ranches, only to reappear with altered brands on railroad-contracted herds. Henry appeared in the lodge entrance, moving carefully with his healing injuries. "You shouldn't have ridden alone," he scolded Hattie gently, but his eyes showed approval. "That shed?" Hattie said. "Could we get in?" "It's locked tight. Guards patrol at night." Henry rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "But they drink more than they watch, if we're careful. We have to try." Hattie stood, her exhaustion forgotten. "Those documents could prove what Sutter's been doing, the land grabs, the stolen cattle, everything." Sarah pressed food into Hattie's hands, dried meat and corn cakes. "Eat first. You'll need your strength." While Hattie ate, Henry conferred with other men from the camp. They knew the railroad guards' habits, the gaps in their patrols. One offered to create a distraction if needed. The sun climbed higher. Henry saddled his paint horse while Hattie remounted Jenny, who had been fed and watered. They couldn't wait for darkness. The judge would arrive too soon. "We'll circle wide through the timber," Henry explained as they rode out. "Come at the camp from the north where the trees grow closest." They traveled in silence, staying under the cover of pine and aspen groves. By mid-afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking the railroad camp. Canvas tents and wooden buildings sprawled along the staked-out rail line. The storage shed stood apart, its padlocked door visible even from their vantage point. "2 guards," Henry murmured, pointing to men lounging in the shade. "But more in the cookhouse. We wait until supper." They dozed in turns as the sun wheeled overhead, keeping watch on the camp's rhythm. When the cook's triangle rang out its dinner call, Henry touched Hattie's shoulder. "Now, they'll be occupied for at least half an hour." They tied their mounts and crept down through the trees. The shed's back wall butted against a steep bank, a blind spot in the guard's view. Henry produced a set of picks from his jacket, tools he'd used in his youth to rescue horses from rustlers' corrals. The padlock clicked open after several tense minutes. Hattie held her breath as Henry eased the door open just enough to slip inside. She followed, her skirts brushing the frame. Lantern light from a grimy window revealed shelves of supplies, coils of rope, and stacks of papers. In one corner, a collection of branding irons hung on pegs, some suspiciously altered. "Here." Henry lifted a leather satchel from a desk, its contents spilling onto the wooden surface. Deeds bearing the forged marks of reluctant sellers. Letters detailing bribes to county officials. Most damning of all, a ledger recording payments to enforcers and the sale of stolen cattle. Hattie's hands shook as she gathered the papers. "These prove everything. The water rights theft, the strong-arming of ranchers." She lifted her skirts and began stuffing documents into the special pocket she'd sewn between her petticoats. A shout from the cookhouse made them freeze, but it was only the workers laughing at some joke. Still, they worked faster, selecting the most damaging evidence. "Enough," Henry whispered. "We need to go." They eased the door closed, replaced the padlock, and slipped back into the trees. Hattie's skirts felt heavy with their precious cargo. Her heart thundered until they reached their waiting mounts. The ride back to town would take hours. They pushed their animals as much as they dared in the gathering darkness, taking the most direct route now that stealth mattered less than speed. The documents rustled against Hattie's legs with each stride of Jenny's steady gait. Stars wheeled overhead as they rode, the night air growing sharper with altitude. Hattie thought of Gideon in his cell, holding on to hope. By morning, they would have the proof to set him free, and to stop Sutter from destroying more lives. "Your father," Henry said during a brief rest to water the animals. "This will hurt him too. The truth about his dealings with Sutter." "Yes." Hattie's voice was soft but firm. "But better the truth than letting evil triumph. Maybe ... She touched the hidden papers. "Maybe this will help him find his way back to what's right." They mounted again, riding on through the velvet darkness. The moon had long since set, but ahead the first pearl-grey light of dawn touched the eastern sky. Somewhere in town, a judge was preparing to hear evidence that would shape all their futures. Henry led them down shortcuts known only to those who had lived in these hills for generations. As they descended the last slope, the town's first morning smoke rose from breakfast fires. They had made it in time. The rising sun painted Carter's Crossing in shades of gold and amber as Hattie and Henry rode down the main street. Their tired mounts picked their way between wagons and townspeople already bustling about their morning business. Several people stopped to stare at the unlikely pair, the rancher's daughter and the Ute scout. But Hattie sat straight in her saddle, the weight of the documents heavy against her legs. The clatter of wheels drew everyone's attention. A polished black carriage rolled into town, pulled by a matched pair of bay horses. The circuit judge had arrived. "There," Henry pointed. "The sheriff's office." They dismounted, Hattie's legs trembling from the long night's ride. She smoothed her dusty skirts, feeling the crinkle of papers beneath. A small crowd had gathered to watch the judge's carriage stop in front of the jailhouse. Judge Monroe stepped down, a tall man with iron-grey hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. His black coat was travel-wrinkled, but his bearing commanded respect. The sheriff hurried out to greet him. "Your Honor, we've got that abduction case ready. One moment." Hattie strode forward, her voice ringing clear despite her exhaustion. "Your Honor, there's evidence you need to see first." The judge paused, studying her with keen eyes. "Young lady, court hasn't convened." "This can't wait!" Hattie reached into her skirts and pulled out the first stack of documents. "These prove Clayton Sutter has been forging deeds, stealing cattle, and threatening honest ranchers." A murmur went through the growing crowd. The sheriff stepped forward, frowning. "Now see here. Let me see those papers." Judge Monroe's tone brooked no argument. He took the documents, adjusting his spectacles. Hattie kept pulling more evidence from her hidden pocket, laying them on the sheriff's desk. Henry stood quietly by the door, watching for trouble. Through the barred window, she caught a glimpse of Gideon in his cell, standing at attention. The judge's expression grew darker as he read. "Where did you get these?" "Sutter's own storage shed." Hattie lifted her chin. "The altered brands are still there, along with more proof." "This is a serious matter." The judge spread the papers across the desk. "Sheriff, I'll need—" The door burst open with a bang. Clayton Sutter stormed in, his face mottled with rage. "Lies! All lies from a spoiled girl and a savage friend!" "That's enough!" Judge Monroe's voice cracked like a whip. "These documents bear official seals, forged ones by the look of them, and these ledgers detail extensive criminal activity. You can't trust anything that little—" Sutter lunged forward. Henry moved faster, stepping between Sutter and Hattie. Two deputies grabbed Sutter's arms as the judge spoke again. "Clayton Sutter, you are under arrest for fraud, theft, assault, and attempting to corrupt county officials. Sheriff, put him in a cell." The judge turned to the deputies. "Search that storage shed. Bring everything you find." Sutter fought and cursed as they dragged him away. Through it all, Hattie stood firm, though her hands shook slightly. "Release Mr. McCall," the judge ordered. "These papers prove he was protecting Miss Carter from criminal conspiracy, not abducting her." The cell door clanged open. Gideon stepped out, dignity intact despite his rumpled clothes and unshaven face. He clasped Henry's hand first, a long moment of wordless gratitude passing between them. Then he turned to Hattie. Their eyes met across the crowded office. In 3 long strides he reached her, pulling her into a fierce embrace that lifted her feet clear off the floor. She wrapped her arms around his neck, not caring who saw. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you." When he set her down, Hattie realized the office had grown crowded with townspeople. They pressed forward, trying to see the documents, whispering among themselves. She heard fragments of conversation, neighbors remembering suspicious activities, cattle gone missing, threats that suddenly made sense. "My land deed," one old rancher said. "Sutter claimed it wasn't filed proper, but here's proof he changed the records." "Those cattle that disappeared last winter," another added. "Look at these sale records. They match the dates exactly." The truth spread through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Hattie saw faces change as understanding dawned, not just about Sutter's crimes, but about how quickly they'd believed the worst of Gideon and herself. Judge Monroe cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, Mr. McCall, I'll need your full statements. And yours too, Mr. Henry. We'll convene court properly in 1 hour." He gave Hattie a gentle look. "Perhaps you'd like to clean up first?" Hattie glanced down at her mud-stained skirts and couldn't help laughing. "Yes, Your Honor. I reckon I would." The morning sun streamed through the office windows, touching everything with clean, clear light. Outside, she could hear the town coming alive with the news. Justice had finally caught up with Clayton Sutter, carried on the wings of truth and determination. Gideon's hand found hers, warm and steady. Together, they stepped out into the bright new day, ready to face whatever came next. 3 days after Sutter's arrest, Hattie stood in the mission garden, carefully tending the young tomato plants. The afternoon sun warmed her shoulders as she worked, humming an old hymn. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up, shading her eyes against the golden light. Amos Carter rode up slowly, his horse's head low with fatigue. He dismounted stiffly, looking older than his years as he approached the garden fence. Hattie straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart beating faster at the sight of her father. "Hattie Lou," he said, his voice rough. "Mind if I come in?" She nodded, unlatching the gate. They stood awkwardly until Amos pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Been doing some hard thinking," he began. "About what almost happened, what I almost let happen." He unfolded the document with trembling hands. "This here's the deed to your share of the spring. Signed it over to your name alone. Nobody can touch it now. Not even me." Hattie took the paper, tears welling in her eyes as she read. "Papa, I was wrong, daughter. Dead wrong. Fear of losing everything made me forget what matters most." He cleared his throat. "Can you forgive an old fool?" She stepped forward and hugged him tight, feeling his shoulders shake as he held her. Later that evening, Gideon found her at the kitchen table, studying the deed by lamplight. "That's good water rights you've got there," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Need someone experienced to help manage it properly?" Hattie smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Already got a good foreman in mind." The savory smell of rabbit stew filled the kitchen as they shared bowls of supper, breaking warm cornbread between them. When the meal was done, Gideon reached across the table and took her hand. "Hattie Lou Carter," he said softly, "I want you to know something clear and plain. I'm asking to marry you, not for protection, not for water rights, not for any reason except love." His voice grew husky. "I love your strength, your kindness, your faith in what's right. Will you have me as your husband?" Tears spilled down Hattie's cheeks as she squeezed his hand. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Summer painted the mission garden in vibrant shades of green and gold. Hattie knelt between neat rows of climbing beans, her cotton skirts spread around her like flower petals. The afternoon sun caught her wedding ring as she tied back a wayward vine, making the simple gold band sparkle. A contented smile touched her lips as she worked, remembering the spring day when Gideon had slipped it on her finger. The distant sound of wagon wheels and horseshoes made her look up. Gideon and Henry appeared around the bend in the road, dust rising behind them as they led a heavily loaded wagon toward the mission. Her husband's tall form sat easy in the saddle, while Henry rode alongside, gesturing as he spoke. "Got those supplies from town?" Gideon called out as they drew near. "And 3 families wanting to rest before heading on to California." Sure enough, 2 more wagons followed behind them. Tired travelers, children, parents, and grandparents, gratefully made their way to the shade of the cottonwoods that lined the mission yard. Their faces brightened at the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen window. "The water's cool and clean," Hattie told them, bringing out a basket of still warm loaves. "Rest as long as you need." A Ute family camped nearby shared dried berries, while a cattle drover offered jerky in exchange for bread. Henry translated stories between the groups, his quiet voice carrying across the yard as shadows lengthened. As evening painted the sky in purple and gold, they gathered on the mission's wide porch. Gideon retrieved his guitar, a wedding gift from Henry's people, and began strumming the opening notes of Amazing Grace. Henry hummed along, the melody weaving through the twilight air. Hattie settled beside her husband, feeling the gentle vibration of the guitar against her shoulder. She looked out at their gathered guests, ranchers sharing coffee with Ute elders, children playing marbles in the dust, weary travelers finding strength for tomorrow's journey. The mission had become more than a refuge. It was a place where the wild heart of the West grew gentler through simple acts of kindness. Leaning into Gideon's solid warmth, Hattie felt the truth of it deep in her bones. With mercy, courage, and unwavering faith, even the hardest trails could lead to home. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.